It's your problem.
fresh or tired? Tired, eh? Words. Right. About to start. Have an H chapter by Save the day again. Also come with a joke. I'm gonna do a quick check on my desk. Got it? Okay with his? Oh, so he doesn't need the. That's from like the 80s, man. What are you doing with that? Like, no hard feelings. No hard feelings. Don't need to give me that look. Like giving me the look like you're gonna kill me. Okay, Victoria, we're about to get started. I just want to confirm that you can hear me and that you can see everything. Huh? That's pretty. Yeah, you're like right at the edge there, right? No sound thing. Why no sound? There's no sound. Maybe that was just old. That's odd. Um, are hello, testing, testing, testing. Can you hear me? Oh, it's actually pretty shitty mic. How about now? Hopefully you folks, some of you will have some ability to like help me with the questions from Victoria in case they come and I'm just like not thinking about checking. Anybody want to volunteer for my class? For Victoria question monitoring and proxying? Awesome. What's your name again? Chris. Thanks, Chris. Cool. Shall we start? Alrighty. Camera's pointing this corner? Yeah. Such a rookie. No, I'm just an idiot. It's fine. Probably better over here anyway. Don't block the thingamajig. All right. 9:07. I'm only 7 minutes late. Whew. So here's what I have planned. I forgot the joke again. So can somebody share a joke with us? No? Maybe Victoria will slack us a joke. What kind of bagel can fly? A plain bagel. I like it. All right, Kong wants to go. What do you call a fish with no eyes? A fish, I've heard this one. Is this from that video with the two guys going back with each other? On YouTube or something? David was showing it to me. I don't know. Can you put that in Slack? Because I wanted to ask David where for that video. Ideally, it should be coding jokes, guys. Come on. It's all about the ether. What's brown and sticky? Is it a stick? Please let it not be a stick. It is a stick. All right. On to more serious matters. On to the realities of boot camp and getting your ass kicked. How's everybody feeling? You know, as things progress, I guess it's easier for things to kind of snowball if you're feeling behind. It's hard to kind of juggle. I mean, this is, it's a type of education where it's not, unfortunately, mastery-based learning. Mastery-based learning is, in a way, better because it allows you to kind of move on only when you feel like you fully grasped something, right? Bootcamp doesn't have that luxury. So that's one of the challenges with it. And so with it comes the challenge of like, well, what do? I got like 80% of today done, or I got 20% of today done, and it's like 6 o'clock. And I also have stuff left from yesterday. How do I prioritize? Am I going to get stuck on today's work because I don't fully understand last week's work? I can tell you a few things about my experience in the last few years in teaching here and working with students, working on the curriculum. For the most part, like everybody or almost everybody will be behind in some way or form. You will feel uncomfortable. And you will, even if you are getting 100% of the activities completed, you are not grasping everything from the previous week. Why I like to do a little bit of review when I do lecture, just because it feels like a blur. If I asked you, if I did a tech interview right now on people, most of you for last week, it'll be hard to recall because it's moving so fast and there's so much shit being. And so, like, how does that work? How is that effective? How do people come out of here and are effective developers and effective learners? Well, in our experience, and while it's not necessarily true for everybody, like everybody has a different learning style and all of that, for most people that come through here, that still works really, really well because you have a lot of things in your subconscious that you're like still holding on to, and the aha moment maybe hasn't fully happened on that content yet, but as you're moving on and building on the topics, that aha moment can still happen on the stuff that you did last week. So sometimes, the goal, the learning outcome of the previous week or the previous day doesn't click in until like this week, for example. Keep that in mind. Also, this is kind of the reality of when you're going to be on the job. Like our industry is just like this. Like I still struggle to keep up with all the things that are out there, and I've been doing this for 10 plus years. Same is true for Don and David and other people, I think, which is that like you're constantly just like learning things at a cursory level, moving on, but hopefully it's a foundation to something else. And we try to do that here as well, right? Everything that you're learning in week 1 is a foundation for week 2 and so on. And so while you may not get 100% of week 1 or week 2, you still need to get a certain amount of it in order to actually feel comfortable with the following weeks. There's like a constant kind of balancing act between how much do I need from the previous week or day in order to kind of feel good about today. So for example, I expect that most of you are not done everything on Twitter up until the end of day yesterday. Is that a fair assumption? I suspect that many of you still don't feel fully comfortable with what you did with Tiny App. Maybe it's with cookies, maybe it's with just HTTP, maybe it's with stuff even kind of from week 1, which is like the whole callbacks thing and asynchronous programming and control flow in that whole thing. Right? Like these things still will take time to sink in. And the truth is, like asynchronous programming, like we are doing with JavaScript, with callbacks, they're just going to be there throughout the whole bootcamp. Like if you feel like you're not comfortable, but you're still able to kind of get by with learning it, well, that's okay as well, because you have the whole bootcamp to get comfortable with some of those concepts, right? You want a certain level of comfort, but that you're like, I don't fully understand. I can't explain it to someone else or teach it to someone else yet. That takes time. Okay. Anyway, that was all just making sure that everybody's feeling okay, because I know that week 1, week 2, week 3 are actually the most challenging from a motivation, from a self-esteem perspective, I guess. Right? The imposter syndrome is highest in 1 and 2. Week 3, you've got just a snowball effect from the first 2 weeks, right? And then the midterm does its fair job of kicking your ass in different ways, right? The TLDR is even after boot camp, you're still doing boot camp for a year, right? This feeling of imposter syndrome and holy shit, something we're trying to get you used to that feeling as well. That's part of our mission, not just a JavaScript, Ajax and things. Okay, let's do a little bit of review, hopefully only about 15 minutes worth, maybe 10 minutes, because we do have quite a bit of live coding and discussing around jQuery to do as well. And you know me, I tend to go over, so I need to be a little bit better with my initial time. In the review, we'll talk about a few things that I wrote down. We're going to be talking about APIs quite a bit, and we talked about APIs starting in week 2, day 1, on the Monday. In fact, you had a reading and a quiz on API. Let's just do a quick recap on if you were asked by like maybe a layperson or somebody who's starting week 1, or in the prep course, and they asked you to explain what an API is. How would you describe that to them? And then what would you give as examples? What does that mean? Can we elaborate on that a little bit? Give some examples instead? Somebody else? If that was good enough? For more class participation, and please keep an eye on Vic for me. A way for 2 programs to talk to. Okay, so example time, if that's true. So examples include payment processor. Wasn't expecting that for initial one. It's what you did for work? Yeah, so a payment processor. Did I spell processor correctly? Yeah, I think that's right. I feel like my spelling has just degraded. Like I swear I used to be good at it. Payment processor API, something like Stripe or some of the other ones that are equally popular. Yeah. So Google Maps API. GitHub API is what we used to access our profile information or some public data in week 2. GitHub Avatar Downloader. Remember? Any other examples? So Facebook Auth API or Google Auth API, right? Google login, Facebook login. Anything else? What's a similarity between all of these? Yeah, these are all company-based, so that's one. But there's another similarity that's more technical. Client server, so these are all client server, and going further deeper into client server, these are all web-based APIs. These are all sort of HTTP/web APIs. Is that a fair statement? Is that true? Like, is that all APIs are? Can I get some non-HTTP web APIs? Good question. FTP is a protocol, which is perhaps a subset of an API or like a within the API realm. It is still software talking to other software. So I would assume protocols would fall under APIs, maybe in a way, or like kind of like a sibling of API. And you can also have maybe, and that's what I'm trying to get to, the next thing, yeah. DirectX, whoa, I was not expecting that. Some people here might not know DirectX or OpenGL. These are getting into like graphics APIs. DirectX, I believe, Microsoft. OpenGL is more open, so it's all, I think, more open source and also pretty popular. What do these allow us to do? These allow us to render graphics on our machines, right? Other ones, again, pretty creative. I didn't expect such different ones. Node, absolutely. What about the Node API? What about JavaScript API? What about Express's API? Right? Let's not lose sight of the fact that, yes, there's like, we're web developers, so we're going to gravitate towards, oh yeah, like API. Our mind jumps to, you know, HTTP web APIs. But anytime code is using another code, like literally like your function is calling another function, that function has an API. Okay. Right? So API is even happening within your code base. You create a module, and I know we're still not comfortable creating modules in JavaScript. We don't focus on it that much, but we consume a lot of modules, right? The Express module, EJS module, right? I guess body parser, we just use it a little bit. Like, you know, the middleware has an API in Express, right? All of these things are an API. So whenever you're actually crafting code, you are creating API. Because within your code, it's still talking to each other. Now, you might be creating a open source library like jQuery or Express, in which case it's not just code that you're consuming, it's code that you're giving to other developers, and you really got to think about documentation and explaining it and constructing it really well, because it's going to now be out in the open, right? And other people are going to build on it. That's when you have to really craft it well, compared to like taking shortcuts perhaps, right? Cool, that's a good enough review, I think. Yes, are we feeling good with that recap? Not just web stuff, even though that can be an easy way to kind of start with it. And then where does JSON fit in with all of this? What is JSON? Not exactly accurate. Data storage. Data storage is technically accurate, but not accurate enough. Yes, that's correct, but I'd like a more technical explanation, just like more than data storage. A standardized format to represent data using JavaScript object notation. Is that a fair statement? So it is used for storage, you're right. Like you can actually store the data to disk using something like Mongo, which excuse me. Can somebody, there's a specific thing I want to also focus on with JSON here. Is anybody? Yeah, it's not just storage, it's data storage and transmission. Right? In order to transmit data, we need to turn it into, ideally, especially for HTTP's sake, we need to try and turn it into text. Something that's like easily understandable for not only humans, but not only computers, but also humans. Right? Sure, a PNG is also data, but it's binary data. It's not something it's good for like rendering an image, but it's not good for like data in the sense of like user information, right? Yeah, when you open an image in a text editor, you're just going to get random characters because there's more than just ASCII characters in there. More than just letters and numbers. It's a whole bunch of different things that a text editor is struggling to represent, right? And so if you just do cat on the command line, CAT, to just like output all the contents or open it up in Sublime or something, you're going to get a lot of weird things. Your terminal may even start making beeping noises because there's some like characters that happen to be transmitting like sound characters, right? But coming back from the binary data stuff and back into kind of like user data or Facebook data and things like that, we want to be able to transmit it over the wire, over HTTP, and also store it. And JSON is a good way to at least transmit it and maybe even store it. So it is actually a string representation of our stuff, right? String representation of our data model. Nested objects within objects with arrays somewhere in there as well, array of objects, things like that. And so to illustrate this, a quick recap on this is something like this, right? Like we have the idea of an object, E with a value, right? But the way to actually do this in JSON is to actually have it as a string, right? So it looks something like this. And I have to escape those double quotes because I'm within double quote land, right? Did I do that right? So now that's a string that represents a data structure. There's a difference, right? And I can use a built-in API, JSON.parse, turn that back into actual object that I can then look at data from a JavaScript perspective, right? Actually use it as an object, not just a string, because what can I really do with a string? I can append it with other strings, I can display it, I can transmit it, right? Or store it. But I need to be able to serialize and deserialize, which another word for that is encoding and decoding, right? It is an encoding of the data, aka serialization. They're synonyms for what we are doing with our actual data and transmittable version. Does that make sense? Okay, switching gears, jQuery. We spent what, a day on it? You must already be masters. What is jQuery all about? It's a JavaScript client-side browser library. Is that a fair statement? Is that what you were saying? What's your name again? Chess? Chaz. Can you spell that? Yeah. Chance. Why do I struggle? Okay, Chance. Chance. I only understand Indian names. No, I'm kidding. Bad joke. Bad joke. So JS client-side browser library. Okay. What does it allow us to do? DOM manipulation. And I guess that includes CRUD, right? Like creating, reading, updating, and deleting DOM nodes in the structure, allowing us to manipulate things on the page. But do we really need jQuery for that? Yep, in the back. All right, we could be copying, pasting taglines. But the write less, do more is a hint at what I was asking, which is, do we really need jQuery? No, right? It's still working within the confines and limitations of what the browser allows us web devs to be able to do on web pages, right? Yeah, that's changing the page after it's been made. That's a good point. So changing the page after it's been loaded, right? That's essentially DOM manipulation. So great, more sort of English definition of DOM manipulation. I like it. What else does it allow you to do? I guess that's mostly what you've done so far with it, right? The other thing that it allows you to do, it basically is, okay, before we get into that, it basically gives us a level of abstraction in an easy to understand and learn way. So a level of abstraction just means like we can do all of these things with just maybe more code or code that's like different across different browsers. Not true anymore as much, really true. And like it has its own kind of way. It's like browsers have an API, right? If I actually just Google right now, browser API, like that's a thing, right? Whoops, sorry. And if I Google web API, there's a whole bunch of objects essentially, and this is kind of unfortunately named web API. In my opinion, this should be called browser API or client API or browser client API or something like that. Because like, what do you mean by web API? Like the web is more than just a browser, right? It's a bit too, I would say it's misnamed. Just something for you to keep in mind. But essentially, web API is like web browser API. There's all these objects that you have access to and functions, right? As just somebody who's working in the browser and executing JavaScript in the browser. So that's things like, I believe we've covered some of them, right? Window, document navigator, has this been covered a little bit? We have the window object in Node, we have the process object, we don't have a window. And there's a whole bunch, right? There's the geolocation API. There's an audio API now built into the browser, so you can actually generate audio with code. Canvas API to be able to draw things. There's a WebGL API to be able to do graphics, 3D graphics in the browser. There's a lot of cool shit in the browser that didn't exist 10 years ago, right? And jQuery just takes some of those things that used to be there for longer than 10 years ago that were like a mess, right? Every different browser was doing things differently, had different quirks, different bugs, and it basically created a common abstraction on top. So just keep that in mind, that everything we're doing here can be done with the browser version of the API. And I'll try and even visit some of that stuff as we cover the AJAX side of things. So one of the other things that allows us to do is AJAX request. So with AJAX requests, what the heck is that? It's our first sort of entry into doing it, but I will ask maybe you guys to help me define it. If people already know, have some clue, want to take some guesses. An asynchronous request to the server. What does the asynchronous part mean? It's a good definition. What does the asynchronous part really mean in terms of English? When we send a call to a function, it will have basically that callback effect. So that's correct from asynchronous. It's not blocking. Yeah, so asynchronous means non-blocking, right? Async means non-blocking. So, when we're doing JavaScript code and we're using things like for each is not asynchronous. Like it essentially does the actual things, it goes through each item in an array, and then whatever you have as a console log after the for each is going to execute at the end of that. right? But there are certain things that are asynchronous, right? Like adding a dot on click onto your DOM element, right? That's asynchronous in that like that callback function is just going to be called sometime later, right? But that pretty much dot click runs instantly. There's no waiting for the user to click until we execute more code, at least from what comes after the on click, and we're just able to proceed. In the case of web though, and making an HTTP request, what does that mean in terms of HTTP though, in terms of the actual network request? Yep. It can send a CRUD request or an HTTP request without leaving the page. So it's happening kind of in the back. When you go to a website, you type in google.ca or google.com, that definitely has a little bit of like UI blocking, right? Like the page has to load. There's nothing I can do until that page loads. And like it has to download all that stuff. A traditional non-asynchronous HTTP request, which is how you request the initial page, is a blocking request. It's synchronous. So with TinyApp, right? With TinyApp, we created a web app without any async HTTP. Is that a fair statement? Everything from our get to our post to maybe you did a delete, all of those HTTP requests were essentially changing the UI of the browser, not just the page. Like you could see a spinner in the tab, you can see a progress bar maybe in the address bar, and the user has to wait for the whole thing to happen, and the page is essentially like going to get destroyed maybe and recreated because new content is downloaded from the post request or from the HTTP from the GET request, right? So this is an example of still commonly used paradigm known as like a multi-page app. Each page is a separate synchronous request. Again, get, post, whatever it is, right? And what we're doing with Tweeter is that we're learning a different paradigm. We're doing more of a single page app type paradigm. Now it's truly a single page where like there are no other pages to work on in the sense that there is literally nothing else to click that takes you to another completely different looking page. But a single page app doesn't really mean that it is just that. It could mean that there are actual multiple pages, but that everything is done in terms of swapping pages in and out is happening asynchronously. And so we're going to see an example of that. I'll do a quick example of that right now maybe. So I've got some code set up. And I've got this like simple Ajax example right here, right? It's just a boilerplate with some jQuery. And it's requiring this file called Ajax example, which is really just empty right now. So let's start this up. What is it? Ajax example. Hi, I'm a web page. So what we're going to do with this is just to demonstrate, very quickly demonstrate the simplest possible Ajax request I can make. Okay? And the simplest possible Ajax request I can make is basically requesting some other content as a GET request behind the scenes. Okay? So maybe I will request something called, I'll just create another file called other.html. And it will just have like a paragraph. Hello. Okay. And so let's pretend that this is content we want to load after the user does something. They click a button or something happens and there's more data to show them. They click next page or they click show me more. And we want to load it without like refreshing the whole page or taking them to a new page. How would we do that? So we're going to pretend that the user has clicked and stuff. I'm not going to write all that code just yet because we have another example where we're going to get more into the jQuery stuff. But I'm going to use jQuery, and I'm going to do the simplest possible piece of code in jQuery to get that going. I'm going to do a $sign because jQuery, almost everything starts with a $sign. And I'm going to use a get. Okay? And the get will basically take a URL because I'm fetching, right? It's the verb and the path. And in this case, it's going to be on my domain. And it's just going to be other.html. And then I'm just basically going to see what happens when I console log that because I'm working in small steps, right? I'm still learning. Right? I've written very little code here, maybe from an example that I found online, and I want to see how that works. Now, first of all, I just want to make sure other is fetchable, right? So I should probably even just test to make sure I can fetch other.html, that my server is set up correctly. It will respond to other.html. That works, right? Going back to my actual main page, I'm going to now open up console. Sorry. And do a quick refresh. Oops. Interesting, right? What did we just witness? What's the sequence of events that just happened? Yeah, if I were to look at the network tab and look at everything, zoom out a little bit. And I'll just hit refresh here. The first thing that happens is the browser requests our main page because that's where we just went into the address bar. It loads all the necessary dependencies that we have, script tags, CSS things like that. In our case, we needed jQuery, and we needed it to make a request also to fetch Ajax example.js. And then we said, oh, this code here, we'd like it to actually, fetch some other code, some other content rather. And so it actually goes and makes another request, an HTTP request, that's a XHR request. So if I filter by XHR, I've made one XHR request, and I've made two JS requests, jQuery and example.js. Two JS files were loaded, and one Ajax or XHR request was made. XHR is just a shitty acronym for making an Ajax request. They're both actually really shitty acronyms. Ajax stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. There's no XML happening here at all. So, whoops. Didn't have foresight into thinking about that when we named it. And there used to be XML. And XHR is short form for XML HTTP request. No XML. So, well, whatever. Those are just legacy names that we've just had to carry forward. If you want to just think Ajax when you see XML HTTP request or Ajax, that's fine with me. Right? Think asynchronous. Don't worry about the XML part. The reason it's called XHR, by the way, is XML HTTP request is the kind of web API object. That's our API to be making AJAX requests in the browser. Every single browser gives us this object, XML HTTP request, just like every browser gives us window and document, right? Whoa, can't type today. And this page has literally no examples. Thank you, MDN. And this is how you would write the same code that I wrote in jQuery. I mean, they're changing the inner HTML of thing. I'm console logging, so you can ignore this part here. Just pretend you see a console log here. But this is the code that you would have to write in traditional without jQuery. Not exactly as nice to read, yes? And so this is, again, why jQuery is more of the nicer, easier to learn and write, more elegant API. Although that's also changing. And we won't get into this too much, but there's another API that's come out that's kind of a replacement or a trendier, more hipster version of this thing that's come out with the new web APIs that's called the Fetch API. Does anybody know about the Fetch API? I don't expect you to. And so that's the more modern version of the XHR thing. You're not expected to use this. This is just for you to know. You're still going to just be using jQuery stuff. This is not used as much yet. People still just use jQuery instead. But the Fetch is described as the Fetch API provides an interface for fetching resources all over the network. It will seem familiar to anyone who has used the XHR, but the new API provides a more powerful and flexible feature set. Essentially, it's kind of a successor, has some pros and cons, but it's a nicer syntax, similar to what we have just done with jQuery. Now, here's the other kicker. And then we'll take a break, because I'm probably throwing a lot of shit at you all at once. The way I just wrote this is actually jQuery 1 syntax. And this is the other problem with using, well, it's just with learning libraries that have been around for a long time. When you're Googling for API documentation or examples, you may get examples that look like this, that will kind of give you the older syntax. And then it's up to you to really go, when was that written? And the answer probably doesn't include the version that they used. You kind of have to kind of go, is this the right way of doing this? Like, I maybe get it to work this way. We just got it to work this way. But there's actually a more modern syntax that jQuery has changed its kind of API to be more modern, to do things better, which we will learn a little bit about in the future. And so this works, but it's technically old syntax. If we look at the history of jQuery, and I just wrote this out quickly before lecture, of just the major versions that were released with jQuery, the first major version, 1.0, came out in late 2006. It's a long time ago in terms of the web, right? And then 2.0 in 2013, and not in 2016 for 3.0. And we're currently at 3.2, right? So we're really using 3.0 syntax, ideally, if we're using it from scratch. But we may be inheriting code when we go out and work somewhere that may be written in a JavaScript 1.0 syntax the way I've written it right now. Okay. So just to be clear on that. Oh, and by the way, we'll modify this a little bit. But the modern version of this is to not put the callback in directly, but to actually get an object back from the get thing. And then on that object, we can register as many callbacks as we like with the .done. We can do multiple .dones. It's a little bit more flexible. And you may ask yourself, why is that important? You can leave that question aside for now. Just know that it's more flexible for some reason. There may be use cases for that. And again, we should be able to do the same thing here. Let's see if that's indeed true. I've commented out the old way, and I'm doing this the new way. Now notice that I've actually indented my code, but I'm not in an if statement, I'm not in a loop. That code is just basically chained to the .done, because we get some object back here, and then we can apparently call .done on that object. And then we can pass the callback to that instead of to the original .get. Okay? You guys with me so far? Or am I going too fast? Okay? So this indentation is not the same indentation in the sense that, like, if I do another .done, I'm not going to do it like this. I'm just saying it's on the same object that I had before. Okay? But anyway, let's make sure this works first. And I will not be putting a semicolon here, right? If I put a semicolon on line 8, I've said, like, I'm done with that thing, right? I got to put a semicolon at the end here, right? So let's refresh and make sure that we see the thing in the console like KV promised. Seems to work. Let's actually modify, in our Ajax example, let's just have a div with an ID called main. And we'll just, instead of console logging, because that's great for debugging and making sure things are working, we'll just add things to the main that come back from the thing, right? Now, almost instantly as I load the page, it looks like it happens right away with the page, but it could have happened on a click of a button, for example, right? And to maybe even demonstrate that, what I'll do is I'll put this in a function. Some kind of function that fetches us data for some reason, right? And call it multiple times. Maybe once every second. Right? Remember, I'm not calling the function here, I'm just giving it the function reference and letting it do its thing. I shouldn't have had to do that. So we're seeing this page kind of, the DOM is getting manipulated, but nothing is really happening to the page UI. It's not blocking. I can still navigate. I can still do things on this page, right? This maybe simulates, I don't know, like some kind of timeline on Facebook or something like that that's updating as changes come in, right? Without me having to hit refresh on the page, while me still liking those things. It's not destroying the whole page and recreating it. If I'm liking a particular post on Facebook, well, that wouldn't work so well if every time there's a new post, the whole page has to refresh. About to click like, and the whole page just refreshes on me. That would be really annoying and not something that would be usable, right? So for modern apps that are very dynamic, Ajax is a must. But the whole app doesn't have to be Ajax. When I, on Facebook, click on events or something, it does a whole page refresh to take me to events or take me to the Messenger app, maybe. But on that itself, it can have some Ajax components that are fetching in things on an interval or something like that, like my Messenger. Are you seeing the difference? It's not just about, is my app all single page or all multi-page? It's this page itself is a single page app, but it's one of many pages in my actual app. So it's a multi-page app, like Facebook, with many single page apps within it. Right? Your timeline is a single page app, your Messenger is a single page app, your events is a single page app, things like that. And with Twitter, obviously we're not doing something at that scale, we're just doing a very single page app, right? This is going on still, of course. So that sucks. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I'll talk about what we're going to do after the break, and we'll take a break. What I'd like to do is for us to, and I've written a little bit of server code here, something that will look a lot familiar to you from the Tiny App days, so it's a good recap. It's using Express and Body Parser, really For handling post requests, we need body parser to just easily parse the post requests. We're using the Express static middleware to just serve a lot of these public HTML and JS pages. And really, we have these, it's basically a coffee database. That's the example I used in the last lecture, so I'm running with it. And essentially, you can fetch coffees in from this database as JSON. So it's not doing renders or redirects. It's not using EJS. It's just submitting things as JSON. And I can, of course, post a coffee as well, which will save it to the database that I can then fetch again for more coffees. And I love this. I just had to use that. Still pretty culturally relevant. Cafefe is a type of coffee. Not, I don't. It should be. Any questions so far? I haven't done a good job of pausing for questions before we adjourn. So not questions about this, because we'll talk about this after the break, but questions of what we did with the Ajax example. Any confusion still? Let's clear it up if we do. So what is Ajax doing here? That's a good question. What's happening here, let's take a look at the network and the debug, the developer tools. What's happening here is that I have code set interval, which is just not Ajax itself. That's just a thing I'm using for demonstration purposes. It's kind of like set timeout, but it's just running the same function over and over every second so that I can demonstrate that I am making behind the scenes requests from my same server for a different file, which doesn't have to be JSON, by the way. It's HTML in this case. And I'm just taking that and saying, please give me the data that comes back. Now, other.html literally returns. If I go to localhost 7000 / other.html, view source, that's literally the data that I get back, is that one line. And so that's exactly what I get back, and I console logged it. And I get that back, and the first thing I do, and the only thing I do, is I append it to the DOM, right? Just for demonstration purposes. So that because console log is not as nice. But if I were to console log it, I would just see it every second here. So every second I'm making a network request. Pretty expensive, but I'm just doing it to demonstrate that I'm making all these Ajax requests while I could still be doing other things on the page. And all it's doing is appending more DOM elements to the node. In fact, if I look at my elements, more and more keep getting created, right? And that's what we see on the page as well. So we had our initial page load of index.html, which downloaded jQuery and downloaded our JavaScript file, which had this code in it. And this code said, please use jQuery and the XHR object, XML HTTP request object from the browser to make GET requests to this other URL. And the other URL is /other.html, so on the same domain. If I were to quickly write that down, so this is our simple example. We did a typical synchronous request for index.html. The JS on that page makes another HTTP GET request async using jQuery's .get, which really jQuery uses XHR to make an async GET request, also known as an XHR request, and calls our callback, calls jQuery back, which then calls our callback, right? So essentially XHR is reporting back to jQuery because jQuery is a level on top. jQuery says, okay, cool, I'll send a callback to the code. I'll invoke the callback that was here, this callback function right here, right? And then in that, we use jQuery. In that callback, we use jQuery to use the data that came back. We append it to the DOM. And for demo purposes, we do this many times using set in 1 second, every 1,000 milliseconds. Is that a better kind of breakdown of what's happening? Hiding in the what? Sorry? Yeah, all of the major stuff is really happening because of this function, this API from jQuery that's been given to us that we can open up the documentation for as well, as we should. And that behind the scenes, maybe it even mentions it, I'm not sure. It'll mention XHR everywhere, right? Because that's just short form for Ajax these days. And it talks about this other object called the jQuery XHR object. Sure, and it talks about the history of jQuery as of jQuery 1.5. You know, here's some detail. But like ultimately, we're dealing with XHR behind the scenes. We're just not dealing with it directly because that code is just going to be uglier for us to write and more verbose. I was going to talk about that, but I'm leaving that for after the break. So I'll leave your question for after. Any questions from Victoria? Nothing yet? All good in the hood? Let's take a break. I'll field any questions from Victoria as they come up. Yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, good question. So let's go back to our notes. So there was index.html, that's file 1. Main file, let's call that the main file. That's our like page that we requested. That's just like, hey, oops, sorry, that's the wrong one. Sorry, it wasn't index.html, it was Ajax example.html. So let me fix my notes here.
That's the DOM.
That's the DOM, exactly. So we should even write down, because this is typical, you know, DOM is created from this, which has our main div, right? So example right here, there's our main div. But it also loads this JavaScript, which is really, we could just write it in line here. Like I could have just written it all in here like this, right?
You could just
The Ajax call there. Yeah, but like that's just not, you know, it's not nice. Yeah, it's just harder to like maintain. But I could have done that if it maybe it would have been simpler for demo purposes. But like this is essentially the code that gets executed once the page is done loading. So actually we should also talk about that a little bit, and I'll recap that because that's a good question. When the DOM is fully loaded, it triggers our JS code. Our JS code then does this, right? Makes another, uses jQuery. Yeah, we already mentioned. So read 1 and 2 again because I've changed the text, and tell me if that's a good, better explanation.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
no,
just.
no, it's
Okay, let's resume. Most of us are back. I think they were missing a person or two, but I got to keep going. Victoria, all set? Okay. So one thing I didn't kind of review, which is important-ish, is a question that came up during the break, so I'll address it now, which is, hey KV, how come like you're putting your script tags at the bottom of the body here, when oftentimes we see them in the head tag, and what's the difference? So I could, of course, and the way it's meant to be put from a like how the web was meant to work, was to put it here in the head tag. Right? This is kind of meta information about how the page is going to work. Why aren't we putting our script tags there? We can, and what that does is it downloads the JavaScript earlier on rather than later on. And if we keep it at the bottom, what the benefit we get is because it happens last, it's a little bit more performant because the JavaScript doesn't have to execute for like CSS and other things to render. So the page has slightly better performance in terms of the painting and the rendering of the page actually happens faster. This is just a habit that web developers who work on production code have kind of developed over time, is to just kind of cheat and get a little bit of extra client-side performance by putting the things at the bottom and putting the blocking code, like the JavaScript code at the bottom, because you don't need that to execute to render the page. And then, but the CSS code would be, at the top. And then the other benefit you get from putting your scripts at the bottom is that you don't need to use the, this thing here, the document ready function, which is just the $ function, which is an event that gets called by the browser that's saying, hey, the DOM has been created. That whole HTML has been converted into elements, and now you can start doing your DOM manipulation. Well, when you leave your JavaScript at the bottom, all browsers nowadays will only run that once the DOM is also created. Once everything is done, once even the whole body has been constructed in the actual memory, right? And so you can actually avoid this extra kind of, callback function to be invoked when all the JavaScript, when all the DOM has been. Now, it's still not bad practice to have this and keep your JavaScript at the bottom, right? There's no really bad thing that happens. And what's also nice about having this is if I have a var here, right? It's not a global, because it's inside this callback function, it's not available globally. And so it also forces me to just have a closure around my, have a scope around my variables. So it's another reason why you should maybe continue using this if you're just doing apps like this with jQuery, where you still have your document ready, essentially written like this. Is this recognizable to everybody, this first line? It's kind of very bizarre, right? The other way to write it is like document.onReady. But you just write it so much that they're just like, well, why don't we just do document.ready? And then they're like, well, why don't we just do So if you pass a function into the $ thing, it's basically a document ready function callback. It's just short form for document.onReady callback function. Anyway, we don't want to, if you're not sure exactly what I was just talking about, that's okay. It's not super important, and you can read up on it afterward. I did a little bit more restructuring on what happens based on the question from Jane, but also, what was your name again? Chandra. What is it? Krishna Chandra, nice. It's a badass name. Are you joking or is it actually? Oh, that's really cool. Okay, so we'll have this. I'll send these out as notes. My other example is really the JSON API-based coffee app. I don't know, call it that. And what we're going to do is take a look at this quick server that we whipped up. where we have this like in-memory quote-unquote database, just like with our tweets and our URLs from TinyApp. And we have these HTTP endpoints, right? APIs for the browser to make requests. TinyApp had them too. They were just not AJAX requests. They were just regular synchronous requests, HTML requests. And these are going to be JSON requests instead. So for example, I apparently have this /coffees get, right? Or get/coffees. Well, if I'm inheriting this code and I didn't write it, or it's been a while, just looking at this and knowing what I know about Express and seeing this one line of code that's implying something about response.json, I should expect that I should be able to, oh, and by the way, joke. Has anybody seen this one yet? This is what it's like to work with CSS. Like this, the blindfolds are like the page, and you're trying to like modify it. You're just like, why isn't this? Until like everything just goes like white, I think. It's just like, what the? I brought this up during the break because I was like, I usually bring this up as one of my jokes. It's hilarious. This is what it feels like to work with CSS, right? Anyway, seeing this /coffees means that I can access the /coffees, right? I don't need to do that with jQuery. I can just do that, and I do indeed get my results in a string format, but the string is not HTML string; it's JavaScript object notation. Now I have a nice Chrome extension that makes this look nicer. Actually, the way it comes in is, if I refresh this network tab, the way this is coming in is, remember how I typed it out, Node, just as a demo? All just, doesn't have to be on multiple lines. That's just, why bother? Why does code need to be on multiple lines? Really just for us, right? This is computer to computer, so it's all in one line. You can see that it's actually like keys and values, but it has to have double quotes around them, around strings. And this whole thing is a string, right? And then what's nice is DevTools will parse that for us. And in my case, I have a Chrome extension that also parses it so it doesn't look ugly, right? And turn it into a nice little collapsible structure that I can navigate. But this is a good way to test it. Another way to test it would be through curl, right? Whoops, stop the server and curl. Obviously, that's not going to work. Right, and here's the data coming back. Okay, so what we're going to do now is write some code to work on our other page, which is our coffee app, and really be able to create coffee, so it has a form. And all it is just the type, I think, because that's all we're saving, right, on the server. Just the type. So all it asks the user is like, what type of coffee would you like to create? And we also have our list of coffees, ideally put into this UL, right? But we want to load it dynamically after the page loads. So initially, this is just a container. It could be a UL, it could be a div, it could be a section, doesn't really matter. Some kind of DOM node, right, where I'm going to append stuff to it. And then, of course, I'm going to run jQuery as well as my JavaScript code, keeping it in a separate file just for nice separation of code, right? And so this is going to be my client JavaScript. Here's my client JavaScript. I want to make sure everything's looking good, so I'm going to write as little bit of code as possible, which is, hey, DOM is ready. Let's console log that. And let's actually go to our page. I think it's index.html. All's well, right? Now we want to start using jQuery and XHR, AJAX, so asynchronous requests, to both fetch coffees as well as be able to submit coffees, Sound familiar? Tweets, coffees, whatever, right? What are we going to do? Remember, this is the part of the demo and lecture when I want to work incrementally and still show how you ought to be working incrementally. So don't give me the entire thing. Tell me what I want to do next as a first step. $.get of getting of coffees. And I could write it the old school way with the callback function in here, right? Or we know that we have this .done thing that can take in a callback. I might as well write it in the new ES6 way, slightly different than my previous example. But, right? And then we remember that we get data back, right? And so we should just console log the data and then just test that, see if that works. Is that a good strategy? Is that right? Cool, let's run it. We're not going to see any changes on the page. We're just going to look at the console since we haven't changed anything. Nice. Now, as it turns out, and jQuery has come a long way. So in older versions of jQuery, it wouldn't have worked like this. It would have just given me the text that came back from like the server, and then I would have had to parse the JSON. And as it turns out, there's another function that Eric, is your name, was asking about, which is like, is get similar? It was you that was asking, right? Is get similar to Ajax? Because there's also another jQuery function called Ajax, more aptly named than get. Right? And it has a lot of different arguments you can pass to it. The documentation for jQuery is quite extensive. You can get lost in it, so be careful. And simplest ways is it can be called with no arguments. That's just weird. But you know, this is how you can potentially call it as well. You give it the URL as a parameter. In our case, that would be /coffees. Keep going. It looks like we can also call it without the URL key and just give it the first argument as the URL, and then use .done. So it works very similarly to get, right? So what's the difference? Let's try it. I've already made the change. It's client side, so I don't need to restart the app. I'm going to hit refresh. No difference. Really, really bizarre, right? At least from what we can see at this point. So it's a bit confusing. And by the way, there are these other functions that we can also learn about that we'll talk about after if we have time. If not, they're not as critical. But the Ajax function allows us to control a lot more of how we want the request to be made, whereas the get doesn't. It's not obvious in this case, but let's say I wanted to do a post request. I want to save a copy. Do you think I'm going to be using a $.get? Probably not. I'm probably going to be using a $.post. And I'm guessing, without having even learned jQuery, that there's a $.post. Because otherwise, I would be a little upset and that it's not very consistent of an API. Right? And sure enough, there is. And sure enough, both of those are just behind the scenes using $.ajax. And just passing in the argument, which I guess defaults to get, so we don't have to do it for Ajax. But if we wanted to do a post or a put or a delete, you know, and here also with Ajax, you can specify the data type. It will try and automatically do an intelligent guess, which is new to jQuery. Before it wouldn't. So it says, oh, I think what's coming back is JSON, so I'm just going to like convert it and do the parsing. But like you can say, hey, it's actually HTML that's coming back, or it's actually JavaScript that's coming back, or it's actually data in JavaScript object notation or text. You have a lot of different things that you can say. Oh, and here's method. You can pass in the method to say, is it a get, is it a post? And so with the AJAX, you just have to be more verbose, but it defaults to get anyway, right? So just remember that when you're using $.post or $.get, anything that's AJAX related, underlyingly, jQuery is just calling $.AJAX with the necessary argument. Okay? We're just not going to do that because this reads a lot nicer for us, right? It's more obvious as to what's happening, right? So far, so good? And now that we have the data, and when we console log it, what's nice is that it's already converted. I didn't have to do a JSON.parse on the data, please. Right? Because it's coming back as a string. jQuery is nice enough to do that for us. If we weren't using jQuery and we're just using XHR directly in the browser, we would have had to do this as well. So really, these are our coffees. Is that fair? Be more explicit with what it actually is that's coming in. What do we want to do? What's next? Oh, I should. We're just trying to build a kind of a simple to-do app kind of thing where you have your list of coffees, and then you can add coffees, and all that stuff is happening asynchronously so the page doesn't have to load. Sorry for not clarifying that. Yeah, I guess so, right? Like we probably want to show there's only one piece of information because it's simple, which is the type of coffee. And we do have this container, which is supposed to be our coffee list that I've kind of created already, right? It's below the form. So maybe I'll just put a heading right above it. Right? And so our coffees are going to show up below. For now, just a stupid looking bulleted list. We're not going to focus on the CS side of things. Yeah, that's a really good comparison, right? It's important to kind of reflect back on TinyApp. And well, we've already done this kind of stuff with URLs, right? But this is happening asynchronously, getting the data after the page is loaded and rendering it on the DOM. And EJS is good for, hey, it's just a traditional multi-page app. There's this part of the data is not coming afterward. It's coming with the HTML that comes in from the server initially. And I'm going to just render the list of coffees or URLs right into the UL. And then maybe there's even some AJAX afterwards that updates it, right? You could have both. You could have EJS saying, I'm going to give you the initial set. Because on the server, it's going to loop through the coffee database and just, give back. Because right now, we get back an empty list. So if their network is really slow, if they're on not even on 3G, but on edge, first the page has to load. Then they see an empty list. Hopefully they see a loading because it's very confusing. Then they see the coffees come in because there's another HTTP request to go get the JSON data of the coffees. Whereas maybe it's better to just give the coffees initially, and then if there's more to refresh, we'll just use AJAX, right? But we're just focusing on AJAX only for now and not worrying about people and and performance and things like that, right? But EJS is doing server-side rendering. When the request is made and when it's finally sent, it's already got all the HTML with all the copies in it. In this case, we send an empty container down and make another request to fetch the thing. And now our client is responsible for deciding how to construct the DOM nodes, how to construct the elements. So it decides whether it's going to be a div or a UL or an LI. The server just says, here's a UL. Hopefully you'll put in LIs in here. You decide, client-side code. And our client-side code is going to actual building of the DOM manipulation thereafter, right? We don't have to pass in anything because we're just fetching information, right? Well, we want to do a post, but we're not done with our get. So I probably want to move on with, continue on with the get, right? Maybe what I want to do is fetch my, what is it called? Coffee list? Anything from Victoria? Oh, question from Victoria, Johnny. You can Ajax do put delete without method override? Good question. It's a bit advanced for the scope of this lecture. And you're saying it. Never mind. It looks like yes. Yeah, I believe the answer is yes, because the limitation with put and delete and patch, these new verbs, is on the form itself, like how forms work in HTTP and browsers, not actually browser capability. So you can just do a put and delete directly with Ajax, but that's an advanced question, so other people don't have to worry about it. So here we have the coffee list, and I want to just append the coffees to it, right? But the coffees are, what is the coffees? Can I console log it? An array? No, it's an object, right? Curly bracket. So I can use a loop, I guess, to go over all the coffees. Which kind of loop will I use? In, not of, right? Of is for arrays, right? And then in here, we're going to construct an LI in memory. And this is using yesterday's kind of jQuery, a good recap of that. I'm going to create an LI and maybe even assign that to my variable. That's my coffee element, or maybe $coffee to imply that this is a jQuery object that represents the coffee, just for short convention, right? Don't have to do it that way, but it's one of the conventions for denoting a jQuery object. Hey. And so I can then say, please construct this in memory. And oh, by the way, set the inner HTML of it, the inner text of it, to be coffee dot, what is it, type, I believe is what we have. Right here. I've already done a little bit of jumping ahead. I should have done a console log in here, work incrementally, but I'm just short on time, so I'm skipping a few of those incrementally. Right? Now let's just console log this thing. We're not appending it yet to our coffee list. I'm just making sure that I can construct the LI in memory, but not put it onto the page just yet. So I should see, instead of just the data now, I should see 3 jQuery objects, DOM nodes, that don't exist on the page yet. Right here. I see 3 different LIs that I've created. An array, because jQuery works that way, but really it's an array of one thing, which is the LI that I've created. Everything in jQuery, when you create things or request things, they're always a collection. But in this case, it's a collection of one, because each time I create one LI, right? And I'm console logging it at a time. Now what I want to do is append it to the parent, right? To my coffee list. The other way to write this, because jQuery has many ways of doing this, either, and maybe we'll just assign this to a variable. Or const container, but coffee list is maybe a little bit more specific. So I am appending things either using the parent object and saying, please append this child, or child.append to parent. Same thing, different day. Right? Just jQuery gives you Ajax, it gives you get. You can use one or the other as long as you're trying to be consistent and whatever makes more sense to you at the time. Right? Does that make sense? I don't want to do it twice, so we'll just use the format up here. If I refresh, I get to see all of these LIs created. For some reason, they're not fully working. That's fine. We can debug it, but we have progress, right? My reaction to this shouldn't be, oh shit. It should be, oh cool. It's working almost as I thought, right? So let's inspect what's going on here, because I did expect it to work. I'm not seeing the actual text inside of the LIs. So what's happening there? Maybe this is not working? The coffee refers to the object, which is within the objects that we get back, which we should probably continue console logging just so we can easily see them. Oh, I know what I'm doing wrong. Yeah, I always make this mistake coming from Ruby to JavaScript, and I forget that in JavaScript, you just get the key here, right? You don't actually get the, so it's the coffee ID that I'm getting here. Let's be explicit here, not the coffee. And then we're going to have coffee is equal to coffees, square brackets, coffee ID, right? Notice how I also changed the variable of the thing that I misnamed because I was confused. Important. Name shit what it is, right? Let's refresh that because now I have the coffee, which I'm then using as the object, right? I don't really use the ID beyond just to grab the object from the collection. Nice. Got our cafefe. Now, I know we're at 10:36, and in traditional KV fashion, we're going to head into 11. I apologize in advance. I'm a little bit slower and rusty on my lectures. Should ideally finish at 10:30. First, I'm going to pause for some questions, and we got still some code to write because we want the post to work, and I think we can do some cleanup here. So either ask questions or suggest things for cleanup before we proceed. Go. I have a really good question from Victoria, which I'll address. Anything in person? Yep. What does the .done do? That's a good question as well. Anybody want to help answer that question? Yeah, it's kind of a more modern approach to registering callbacks to a thing that gets callbacks. So, with our on-clicks, we just put the callback right there, right? Inside the on-click. We can do that with our get, as I did with the example, but it's just more modern and more flexible to do a .done and then give the callback to it. Same behavior, though. But I'm console logging coffees inside my callback function. What does this do? That comes back as our parsed JSON. So it comes back as actually the object with the copies inside of it. And as we see here, see that here, it's our object of objects, which we have on our server is defined right here as our quote-unquote database that literally all our get does is just turn it into JSON using JSON dot whatever, like code, and send it down. Does that make sense? So the encoding and decoding is happening. The Express is turning it into the string, and then jQuery is nice enough to automatically parse it for it. .done, that's a really good question as well. Is the .done a jQuery? .done is actually part of a pattern, like it's a style of handling callbacks. And so you may see it in other libraries. And it's very similar to the promise architecture. So we're going to get into promises, which is similar to what this is doing, which is deferred. I'm not going to get into those things intentionally. So you're essentially learning about promises and deferred and using them without really even knowing that word. And just put it aside. You can Google it if you want, if you have extra time. Promises and deferred. jQuery talks about it a lot. So maybe I should just say that if you come across jQuery talking about deferred and promise, just know that it's talking about .done or .fail or .always. And those are just, you can read them and you don't really have to fully understand how and why promises exist or how and why these things are done the way they are. Just, yeah, okay, so there's a .done, I got a call for this to actually work. Cool, I'll just do that, right? But in the future, I believe it's week 5, we'll actually tackle promises, no, in week 4. During your midterms, we'll have a lecture on promises that will go deeper into this. But for now, you can just use it without fully understanding it, and that's okay. Does That's just the life of a dev, really. I still go through that, right? Just peel it like onions, right? Like you can't understand all of it right off the bat. So yeah, so we'll just make a quick note in my notes that .done is a deferred syntax which jQuery uses, which is very similar to promises. You don't need to fully understand the theory, why, how of these until later. We'll tackle a more complicated topic. We'll come to it later. And then Victoria had a really good question. This.append $coffee, can you just use this? You cannot just use this in this case for multiple reasons. Jonathan, I think is your name. Is it Joe or Jonathan? And that's because we are using ES6 arrow functions, and remember with ES6 arrow functions, this doesn't behave the same way with ES5 like regular functions. So that's a gotcha. With jQuery, you might come across syntax that says, oh, you can use this. And then you try with your ES6 syntax, and you're like, this is not working. And it's because you're using the arrow function, which changes or doesn't respect this as the same way as the old function, right? So you may want to actually use the regular function callback function syntax and not the arrow function syntax if you want to use this. But I will also go and say that you should just avoid using this and just use arrow functions. And there's a way to get the object that this talks about using the parameter, using this, using the coffees. Okay, so I guess I'll just maybe put it in my notes. While many examples, even in jQuery docs, will show you and encourage you to use this or just this, right? It will not work with ES6 function, arrow functions. And you should just avoid it, avoid using this in this context. Yeah. Good point. This is confusing to this. Good question. Any other questions? Is this code clear? As we write more and more code, it's harder to keep it all in our heads, right? Especially in a lecture structure where somebody else is writing it. So I definitely feel your pain. Now, what about making this better? Any improvements? It's a pretty big freaking line of code. Like, there's a lot of stuff happening here. Can I break this up? My first instinct should always be, can I break this up into more functions? How many functions do I actually have here that I've defined? Sorry, how many defined functions do I have here? Not counting callback functions, like actually named functions. 0, right? Maybe I ought to have at least 1. How many different major things am I doing here? I'm fetching the coffees, and I'm rendering the coffees. Aren't those two very different things? Can those not be fetch coffees, render coffees? 2 separate functions? So let's do that. First of all, I'm going to just do function, and refactoring is always a little bit harder because your code is going to break unless you do it. So incrementally, it's a little bit harder. We're going to have a function called fetch coffees, which is really all of this stuff here, right? I'm going to indent all of this into here. And so now I've just moved everything except the DOM ready thing into fetch coffees, which of course does the fetch using get. But then it's also doing too much, right? That's okay, we'll fix that later. And then just to make sure, I want to make sure this function's still working, I should be able to just call fetch coffees, and then it's just doing too many things, but it's still doing it, right? It's fetching and it's rendering. Is that a good enough first step refactor? So I've got my one function in here now. When I hit refresh, everything should still work. Gravy. And then I would argue that everything that .done does is rendering. Is that a fair thing to say? It's taking the data and rendering it. So I would argue that .done should actually be like this. That reads a lot better to me. And then I would have a function which hopefully is terminated properly. That's called render coffees. And remember that our callback function does get a thing from jQuery, right? It's our collection of coffees. So this is still our callback function. It's just being passed in as a named function here instead of an anonymous arrow function. You guys still with me? I'm going a little bit fast. Yeah? Some of you not so. It's hard to kind of stay energized. I apologize. So I've basically created fetch coffees, which will fetch and then call render. Render is responsible for, I don't know how we got the coffees. I just get an object of objects, and I'm responsible for putting them into the DOM. Doesn't give a shit about HTTP, does not know anything about AJAX or jQuery. Well, it knows about jQuery in terms of DOM manipulation, but not $.get. And so this should work. Render coffees is being invoked as a callback. It looks good to me. Sure, all my closing is happening. The staircase is there. Looks good. Refresh. Nope. Line 26, which is right here. Oh yeah. When I close this, I'm actually closing the function, so I don't really need that. My bad. That second indentation threw me off a little bit. Not working as expected. DOM ready, and then like I don't even see the console log from our coffees. Oh yeah, I still have this arrow function thing happening in here. The arrow function, I cut too many things. The whole point was this becomes the arrow function, so I shouldn't have an arrow function in here. I should get rid of that. That was just stupid of me. Right? As soon as we call this, we're ready to console log and start looping through them. Whoops. Let's refresh. Boom. That works. Great. At this point, I would commit and blah, 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 move on. And then now I need to implement the post, which is going to be a little bit less obvious to us because we haven't done that before. We've done a post with a regular form before, with a tiny URL. We could just have a regular form, okay? Which we already do have. And it says, please submit to /coffees, and please use post. And it will post key value pairs, and the thing it will post is name, or sorry, type, right? And so type will have whatever I've typed in. That will go into the server, which will create a new coffee and then append it to the object with a new ID of 4 or whatever, right? And then 5 and then 6. And then just return with an empty, it won't do a redirect. It will just say success. In this case, we're not handling failures. So we presume no failures, which is obviously bad, but happy path only here. So it just says, yeah, that worked great. It doesn't redirect though, because this is a JSON API, right? But our form is submitting to this. So we should actually be able to see this working without any AJAX. So I'm refreshing here. Somebody give me a name of a coffee. Macchiato. Is that how you spell it? Like that? 2 T's or 1 T? 1 T. No, 1 T, 1 T. No, 2 T has underline. There's no N. What? You're throwing me off, man. Okay, macchiato. Okay, so I submitted to that page. If I had my network tab open, I would have seen a 200 comeback. And if I go back to my my index page, I do see that the data is there. So if it did a redirect, it'd take me back, right? However, this requires the whole page to be refreshed, either through a redirect or for the user actually going back, clicking back to that page. That's not what we want. We want a single page app. We don't want other things on this page to be disrupted. Maybe there's other shit happening on this page, right? And so we don't want the form to behave in its default way. We don't want it to be a default form. We want it to be an AJAX form. Does that make sense? An asynchronous form. And so what we're going to do is we're going to hijack the form. You know? Sounds pretty badass. So we're going to target the form using jQuery. Our form is right here. It even has a new ID. It has an ID with us, so we can easily reference it. If it didn't, we would have to give it one. And we can say, grab it by the ID, and then on submit, and then I can have an arrow function here. But you know what? I don't want to refactor this later. I'm just going to be smart about it. On submit, we're just going to call handle new coffee submission or something like that. Is that okay? And then I'm going to define that as a function. We're handling an event. Just like an on-click, we can do an on-submit on a form. On submit of that thing, I am going to, I guess, just console log. Right, I'm working incrementally here just to make sure I got that part right. I'm going to actually skip this because what I'll find is, and I'm just short on time, when I do this, it will still submit the form. It will do the console log, but the page leaves, right? So I won't see the console log on the old page because now I'm on the new page, which is the one that came back empty from the post request. So I'm not even going to get to see the console log. What I need to do is tell jQuery to not let it submit the form. Please prevent the default behavior of this event. Don't let it do the thing that it would normally do. If it was a click of a link takes you somewhere, right? You can say on click of the link, prevent default, and it will not take the user to that link. And maybe you want on the click of that link to show a little tooltip on top. That's how you would do it. You would prevent the default, and then you'd use jQuery to render a nice little tooltip right above. But you have to stop the default behavior, otherwise the browser is going to leave that page and go to wherever the href of that URL. The same is true for the form action. Are you guys with me? Now we should be able to see that indeed the form does not submit. In fact, it will actually not submit. It will not do a network request. It's preventing all form submission. See? It even doesn't, it doesn't clear this. It doesn't go to the other page. And in our network tab, we don't see any requests happening. Now it's up to us to do the request manually. And we can choose to do it asynchronously or synchronously. Of course, in this case, we want an asynchronous request using $.post, which is another $.ajax request. So we're going to do, I'd like to post to /coffees. Make sure that on my server, it's /coffees that I'm going to post to, right? It's responding to /post /coffees. And in this case, I need to give it some details of what data to post. I can't just post to the URL, like there's content, right? So I believe if I look at documentation, I have to say something like this. And then I actually have to give it the data. What format does the data go up in? Into our API. That would be a good guess, JSON, but it's actually wrong. And that's why I was hoping somebody would say JSON. So this API is not fully JSON. It's responding with JSON, but it's traditional in how it's receiving post requests or parameters for post and get. Instead of receiving them as JSON, it's receiving them as, it's using body parser, and it's saying body parser should parse it as name value pairs, just as though your form was submitting normally. Where you see like key equals value, ampersand key equals value, ampersand key equals value, just like in the URL. It's using the form encoding, as it's called. So we want to encode it using that same structure. If it was a JSON API, then we would say JSON.parse and give it the data. So it depends on which API you're using. Our API doesn't use JSON for receiving data, only for responding with data. So we're actually going to serialize the form, which is another jQuery thing. We're going to grab the form, which is called new coffee, and we're going to call serialize on it. And what that will do is, well, let's just try it actually. If I just we're told that this is some in documentation that this is something. If I just run that right now in my console, this is a good way to experiment, right? To debug. I know that I have jQuery on this page. I know that I can do that. Let's just make sure I can do that. Yep, I get my form. And apparently I'm told that forms can be called, they have the serialized function on them thanks to jQuery. It takes all the inputs and turns them into key value pairs as a string. So it serializes it for submission in the same way that the form would have sent data traditionally. So it's just a convenience so that I don't have to loop through all the inputs in the freaking form and do the name value kind of string concatenation. That's the way the server wants the data to show up. Does that make sense? So we're going to do that. And then we're going to make sure that it works, right? So on done. I can get back my response, but really, I'm just going to, for now, just console log response. Yeah? Yeah, good question, because I kind of blazed past. Where is new coffee? Somebody else? It's the ID of the form, which I quickly showed you, that was already written before class started. And I was nice enough to just already give it an ID so I didn't have to modify it and give it. Just so I can reference it and say, on submit of this, or serialize this, please. That's correct. On line 31, I'm closing, but I'm not calling semicolon on it. The same is true for this. I'm closing it on the get. So I'm calling the function, and then the return value of the function is what I call dot done on. No. Look, this is what the get looks like. It's still finished here. I've just added another argument, which is an object, second argument to the post. That can be quickly confusing at first glance, but it's the exact same pattern as dot get, which I'm not adding another. I could add some query parameters. I want to search for a coffee called cafefe, right? But I'm not putting in parameters in get because I just want straight up the URL. I've just put it on multiple lines, so it's a bit confusing that, this. Cool? So far, so good? So now on done, we're going to hopefully see a console log. We've not manipulated the DOM at all, so we won't see the new coffee show up on the page as soon as I submit it. And maybe we should just on done alert, thank you for your submission. Make sure that's working as well, or just let the user know. Let's just run that. Why am I struggling with coffee example? Is London Fog a type of coffee? No, that's tea, right? Espresso. Flat white. I used to order flat white all the time. I have no idea what it is. Thank you for your submission. So the callback is executing. I'm getting my callback, obviously my console log hello as well. And nothing happened on the DOM, but if I refresh, it didn't exactly work as I expected. It looks like the object doesn't have the data that we expect it to have. Why would that happen? Here, request.body.type is what it looks at. And so we do have the type going in. Is our input not called type? Our input is called type, so key is called type, so it will show up as type. That's odd. Was not expecting that. Let's just see what happens. The way I would debug this is I would look at the network tab when I submit, see what's being sent up. So let's try again with the network tab. Submit. I just want to look at my AJAX requests. Here's my post, right? And I'm sending up type equals. So I am sending up the type. I don't need to set up the ID. I just need to send up the type. That does look correct to me. So what I would do next, if I had, if I had to go, unfortunately I wasn't hoping to debug this, but I would just console log on the server to make sure I can grab the type here because that's how I'm putting it into the collection. And let's restart the server. I made some changes. Let's fill her up again. Request.body is not working as expected. So my body parser is not working as I thought. Why is that? Not sure. Do more digging. Fonts, sends content. Form data is being sent. Maybe if I, so let me write this a little bit differently and then I'll investigate this after the lecture. Maybe if I just did this, data, the type, so instead of using form serialize, I'm just going to say, let's get the value from just the one input field. So that's going to be not new coffee, but the input field itself. The input field is, give it an ID, coffee type. So we'll just say coffee type dot value. I'm going to grab the value from that input, and I'm just using a different jQuery syntax, pass in the data as an object. That works. Now when I refresh, hopefully the latest one, still not working. I'll debug this later, but you're at least seeing the HTTP AJAX stuff happen, right? And I think I'm just missing a specific argument here on passing into it, but I'll leave that for now. And I'll include the correct answer in my notes. Any questions about this since we're at 11:01? The one thing that I didn't cover, well, one of the things that I didn't cover is the fail. If I made a request that just for some reason fails on the server and it doesn't return back a 200, but it returns back like a 500 series error, then instead of done, it will actually not trigger this and it will trigger fail, and then I can have a callback in here, handle the error case, and show the user that they did something wrong or something really unexpected happened. So for your projects, hopefully you'll also, before you submit Tweeter, handle not just done, but also fail. In case the server is just not running, I should see a failure message, right? When I try to submit a tweet, for example. So Joe is asking, is it best practice to define your functions inside the document ready callback? It's kind of getting into opinion. Some people say yes, some people say no. It really depends on how the app is written. It's kind of a complicated question to answer, even though it seems like a simple question. So for now, I would say yes. Assume that our convention in our company is that all developers should put their JavaScript inside the document ready callback, but that you can use the shorter version of the syntax in the way that I did up here. So you don't have to be like document ready, right? And it's understood that that's document ready because we expect most web devs to know jQuery. Is that a good enough answer, Joe? You don't need it because you've got your JavaScript at the bottom of the body, but you're still going to use it because it doesn't hurt and it allows for some namespacing or scoping. Any other questions? Yep. Is it possible to add body parser to the actual client-side JavaScript? It's specifically an Express middleware, so it won't really do anything useful. It is JavaScript. You can execute the JavaScript in the browser, but it will just not execute because it'll expect there be some kind of middleware Express type thing there, and it will just not be used. And it's also you don't need to have it there because really just the browser has to send key equals value up, and then the server has to then parse that into an object, right? And the way body parser does that is just allowing us to access request.body. That doesn't seem to be working right now, but whatever. I introduced some kind of bug when I set this up. But in Tweeter, when you submit, because all that code is already written for you, it will have the data showing up and saving into the database, into the object. So yeah, the answer is no to body parser on the client. Any other questions? Awkward pause. If you're still working on yesterday's stuff, it's okay. Like, continue working on yesterday's stuff. This content is reviewed in the readings and in the exercises that you'll be doing. So, and of course, you'll have the notes. So you don't have to feel like, oh shit, you obviously have to finish yesterday's stuff in order to continue on with your app. That's one of the caveats of working on a project, right? How many people here are done with yesterday's stuff? Almost done. I'd say about a fourth of you, like a quarter of you. So that's good. Try to spend a few hours. Don't spend all day today, hopefully, on yesterday's stuff. Maybe 2 or 3 hours and you're done with yesterday's stuff. But try also not to cut corners. Like, the CSS ought to look like the CSS. You know, the bugs in your character counter have to be kind of fixed up and all of that stuff, right? Okay. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'll send out the notes. Cheers. Yeah, next is you go in the main room. You are kicked out officially. Victoria, any questions? Not bad. The audio was not working initially because my mic was like just slightly far away. So, and it wasn't that far away. It was just like here instead of here.
Maybe this thing adds a lot of.
Maybe. Maybe it's the gain on the red thing. There's the gain here, right? Could be this.
Yeah.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.